Mr. Nelson Mandela will within seconds appear, and that'll be the moment the world has been waiting for. There's Mr. Mandela, Mr. Nelson Mandela, a free man taking his first steps into a new South Africa. Mrs. Winnie Mandela next to him, waving to the crowds. Hand in hand, they leave the Victor Verster Prison.
Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered on SABC3 and the SABC News Channel. My name is Peter Ndoro and I'm staying in for my colleague Desiree Chauke today. Now, tomorrow will mark exactly 30 years since the former President Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster Prison on the 11th of February 1990. He'd spent 27 years behind bars, split between Robben Island, Pollsmoor Prison and Victor Verster Prison as a political prisoner fighting to end apartheid and secure democracy for all South Africans. It was a truly momentous event, not just for South Africa, but the continent and the world at large. And with those first few steps, there was a hope that a new dawn was on the horizon, that with freedom there would be the vote, jobs, houses, access to healthcare, education, and most importantly, being able to live with dignity as a South African. Join us tonight as we take you back to that historic day, the decades that followed, as we ask the question, is enough being done to keep the legacy of Nelson Mandela alive today? Well, helping us reflect on this issue is the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Sello Hatang, who's in our Cape Town studios. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Peter, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here.
And in the studio here in Johannesburg, we're really privileged to have Nelson Mandela's granddaughter, Ndileka Mandela, who's an author and also the founder of the Tembekile Mandela Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to you.
Thank you. Good evening, Peter, and to the listeners.
All right, so, we have quite a lot to discuss, but you at home, just remember that you can join us on this discussion on Twitter and Facebook using our hashtags at SABC News Online and SABC News Unfiltered. We'd love to hear from you and share your thoughts and your comments. Is enough being done to keep the legacy of Nelson Mandela alive today? All right, let's start with the two of you, and I'm going to start with you, Ausi and Ndileka. Take us back to that day. Where were you, and how did it play out for you?
I remember it was a Sunday. I was at Medunsa. I was doing a degree in nursing called BKIA. And, that year, the previous year, Granddad had told us that he would be released, of course. So we knew it was imminent, but not the date. So it was when one of my friends had gone to the dining hall, actually, and she came back, and said to me, "Hey, your grandfather is being released." I remember I had a small TV the size of the monitor. I switched on the TV and I could see there's a lot of excitement outside Victor Verster. We then, at the auditorium there was, the students started gathering and singing with Peter Mukaba, singing freedom songs. And we all gathered there and we were watching again a small TV to watch him walk out, and he walked out late afternoon, and there was such jubilation and singing. We all sang right out of Medunsa, right to the shops in Garankuwa.
Wow.
And there was so much excitement on that day.
Wow. Okay, we'll unpack what it meant as well for you and the family. But Sello, you were a young man in the Northwest at the time, and give us a sense of what it was like for you and how you experienced it and the people that were around you at the time.
It was indeed a very exciting moment, Peter, and one remembers that the build-up was just feeling like it was getting on too long. Like Ndileka explains there, that there was this sporadic marches on the street, and then the moment came and we all had to huddle around television sets. And back then there were very few families that had those. My family didn't have a television set, so we had to go and knock at neighbors' houses to go watch. And of course, while watching it, you're sitting there with a sense of not sure, what does this mean? We know the Nelson Mandela that we kind of created in our minds. We know the Nelson Mandela that we sing about, but here he is finally, and one was wishing just to touch him and know this is real, and that our country will then make a turn for the better. And I like how you said it, that it was a moment for us to turn around what was South Africa into something that was better than what we knew.
All right. Well, let's talk about what those first few steps symbolized. And I guess for a lot of people, it was hope for a better day.
Yes.
Huge expectation on this poor man. And I wonder what you remember about what he said, what he shared about what that day meant and what he realized it meant for so many people.
Well, he shared that the vision he had for South Africans, you know, for better conditions and to be able to, for black people to cast their vote. And there was that jubilation, you know, and I did not, like I said, that we did not even listen to his speech, because as soon as he walked out, we were so excited, we all marched to the streets. But there was so much hope that the conditions under which people lived under apartheid would change back then.
And Sello, in those moments, I guess you almost suspend your pain, suspend the conditions that you're feeling, and just think, oh my goodness, it's really happening, that actually it's on the horizon now.
You know, Peter, one of the things that we keep forgetting is back then, the conditions under which Madiba was released were still horrible conditions. Apartheid was not gone. And we actually want to believe that it was a moment of hope, as Austin Dilega said, that it will get better. But we should also not forget that it was a moment that we shouldn't have let go of it. I was with Goldberg earlier today, Dennis Goldberg today, who, as you know, spent about 23 years in prison. And he was saying to me that one of the things that we let go of from that moment when Madiba said, I'm dedicating the rest of my living years to you, the people, as your servant, is that moment meant that Madiba understood the power of politics, that politics are so important that we shouldn't leave the politics only to politicians. And that was Tate Goldberg's statement. And he again reminds us that that moment should have then been something that we remember, that democracy belongs to the people, and that Tatem Tetonyati's book lives true to this too, that they were betting on a darkie that they didn't know. Now that we know what we know, we can and we should do better. And I'm hoping that we will continue to fight hard to build that country of Madiba's dreams.
All right, so I guess with a conversation like this, and we're asking, you know, is enough being done to remember his legacy? I think even right from the beginning at that speech, one of the things that he says is that I'm your servant. And I suppose in many ways that kind of left us with how he felt he wanted to be remembered. Take us through, I guess there's 2 points of his legacy. There's before prison and after prison, because there were different times and different things that he had to do. Take us through post-prison, that legacy that you think he left behind, because we're going to start unpacking whether it's being properly remembered.
Now, as Silo correctly points out, it was a leadership of servant leadership, of putting Batupili. Granddad at the center of his heart, it was delivering to the people, make sure that the people, the conditions that they lived under apartheid were improved. It was a legacy of humility, because Granddad never changed who he was. It did not matter whether you were the King of England or you were a person that swept in the street. To him, people were human beings. He treated them, he accorded them the same status. It is a legacy of being bothered by any form of injustice. those were the things that were really key to him and defined who he was, in my view.
All right. But there was, Sela, so much to do, particularly in the lead up to 94. So many lives were being lost, and the struggle certainly was far from over at that time. And so he took over the leadership and took literally people across the line.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we remind ourselves of that, Peter, because there's no amount of even denying that apartheid was a crime against humanity that can then change the fact that Madiba helped take us through. He was one of many, though, who did that. And I think the point that Ausindileka makes is also just as critical, because you hear people now also calling him all kinds of names, and you wonder, to what extent will you appreciate that there was a moment in time when actually you were not even allowed to express any opinion at all on the government without your head being smashed. And I think it's an important thing that we remind ourselves that apartheid was bad. And we must never lose sight of the fact that even that moment in 1990, we were far from dealing with the problems that it came with. And to now deny that it was a problem, that it was even a crime against humanity today, is really mind-boggling. And I'm hoping that in Madiba's honor, 30 years on, we will then stop this apartheid denialism and say, actually, what happened was a crime against humanity. And we are still reaping the fruits of that, despite Madiba's efforts of ensuring that we build a more equal, a more a fair society that cares about the most vulnerable in its society. And to keep saying that we will do everything possible to build that country of Madiba's dreams.
All right, and it was difficult in that transition, negotiating, finding that balance to how to get us over the line. And many people look back at that, and some might even say he perhaps conceded too much. But the truth is that we got over the line and people stopped being killed and peace happened. And I just wonder if you could take us through that transition, what you remember, and just how difficult it must have been to be a leader at that time.
Well, first of all, I'd like to remind people that every leader leads within a certain context. Mm. The context of those days is no same as the context of today. And the concessions that he entered into were relevant for those times. I remember with such clarity when the Buipatong massacre happened. I had never seen Granddad so annoyed, you know, and Granddad was a man that could control his emotion. And I remember when I went to see him in Houghton, in the old house, he said to me, you know, darling, a leader must never lose his temper because you lose the plot. And that's when he suspended the talks at the time because of the massacre. And it was a time that was difficult for me as his granddaughter because it was a time that I could not even access him, because when he got out of prison, he now became the father of the nation, the grandfather of the nation. So it was a difficult transition for me to come to terms to the fact that he is no longer my own. But I understood, it is only in later years that I understood what his role was in life and what God had put him on earth to do.
All right, and Sela, if your thoughts again on that transition period to 94.
You know, the transition periods are never easy. And Peter, again, you know, to the viewers at home, we should always remind ourselves that this is a Madiba who was never as meek as we want to describe him. At the very house that Ausindileka is talking about, there was a dinner that he had with Fedi Hartzenberg and General Viljoen. And they were pushing hard for this folk start that the Afrikaners should have their own independent, what would have been a Bantustan of some kind. And Madiba said, no, I can't make that call. And it needs to be something that is then taken back to the ANC. And it was at that moment that they then insisted that he make that call that evening, otherwise they're going to go to war. He apparently just banged on the table and said, well, so be it. Go on, go and make that war. But just know two things will happen. We will then bomb this country to smithereens. It will take us forever to try rebuild it. But the second thing that will happen is our people will continue to defend what they want as a democratic South Africa to the very end, even if it means they just take stones to do so in order to then fight against your heavy machinery of war. And I think if we are to remember that Madiba, it's a Madiba who just didn't make concessions flippantly. It's a Madiba who would think through what the implications of each step of the way was. And it's at these moments that we should always just remind ourselves, our democracy was not built by just President de Klerk saying, you are now free, and that was the end of it. Violence was still perpetuated on our people by the apartheid government. They continued to arm those that they wanted to arm so that they could cause harm. And today we have a country that continues to be divided along the lines of hurt, that we are people who are still dealing with the trauma of apartheid that was a crime against humanity. And I think black on black violence, so-called, happened in a context that Madiba was trying to also deal with a very difficult transition. And today we still have that opportunity to turn our country around, but we must deal with corruption. We must deal with crime. We must deal with the social ills such as abuse against women and children. These are things that we should now be saying, are we doing enough to deal with these things that Madiba said every morning should bother us? That when we wake up in the morning, we should ask ourselves, what am I doing to help build a country of my dreams? And I don't think we're dreaming enough, and we are acting enough on those dreams.
All right, and that's a good point to take this break, because when we come back, I really want us to talk about 30 years on and what all of this means, particularly for young people as they make up the majority of our population. And as they remember this man who is now a man of history, but certainly his legacy is with us. But are we doing enough? We'll start asking that question straight after this. Stay with us.
Today, the majority of South Africans, black and white, recognize that apartheid has no future. It has to be ended by our own decisive mass action in order to build peace and security.
And that was Nelson Mandela's first speech in Cape Town after his release after 27 years in incarceration. Welcome back. You're watching Unfiltered on SABC3 and the SABC News Channel 404. I'm Peter Ndoro, standing in for Desiree Chauke today. Now, tonight we'll be looking back at 30 years to the day when Nelson Mandela was released from prison. And that occasion became a watershed moment for South Africa, and I would even say the continent, a moment that changed the trajectory, particularly of South African politics. Do you remember? Don't forget, rather, to participate in the program and share with us your thoughts on social media. Our hashtags at SABC News Online and at SABC News Unfiltered. All right, so tonight we're asking, is enough being done to keep the legacy of former Nelson Mandela alive? And this is what some of you have been saying already so far, and these are your thoughts. And this one from BAU, who says, dololo, greediness, corruption, lavishness, shamelessness, and other anti-valeurs are all characterizing today's leaders. Another message from Eric, who says, not at all. From other leaders could have wished for, they are enriching themselves to such an extent that they even kill each other. This is not for serving the people, but for money. Money stolen even at national security agencies, SOEs falling apart while commissions are sitting doing nothing, some giving false reports, no one arrested. We, the people, are so ignorant. And Delmani Thompson says today's ANC is a fake comparison to the real African National Congress led by Chief Ntuli, Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo. This is the ANC that I was proud of. They served the people and were leaders of vision. They spearheaded the liberation struggle with great pride and passion, and corruption and racism was never in their blood. Nelson Mandela, I have fought against white domination. I have fought against black domination. Black empowerment is not found in those timeless words. Instead, it's all about non-racial government based on a constitutional democracy, advancing equal opportunity for all race groups. Today, the ANC is contaminated with corruption and it's beyond repair. All right. And thanks so much indeed for sharing your thoughts with us and your messages. And let's start unpacking that legacy, because it is, and I wonder for you, personally, your view, particularly as we think about young people who were supposed to have been the beneficiaries of the work of the likes of Nelson Mandela. 30 years on, the legacy, is it being preserved? Your thoughts?
I doubt if the board freeze, for instance, you know, some of them can even relate to the legacy of my grandfather, because they are born in an era where there is no segregation, you know, and however, their landscape of being conscientized is a landscape when things fall apart. And because of that, they become very apathetic. They've lost hope in government. They've lost hope even in the private sector. Because I remember with such clarity, it was a child that with one of the commissioners here in Joburg, and it was when Commissioner Mir was explaining to her how the concessions that were entered to by the ANC. And she said, I will never forget it. She said, this was a 21-year-old. She said, this is the first time a person of your age has been able to articulate to me why we entered in these concessions. Because you must remember, my landscape of being conscientized is the landscape of the 10 years of the Zuma administration. So that is my reality. And most of these children, that is their reality. It's a reality of joblessness. It's a reality of chaos and anarchy, of corruption. I mean, South Africa currently, in this space of 15 years, there has been over 1 trillion rands that has been misappropriated. That is enough annual budget for a small country. And it's yes, people will say that there's a legacy of apartheid. Yes, there is a legacy of apartheid, but to a certain degree, it is also through corruption that we are in the state. So my son, during this last voting, you know, this last election, he told me point blank, he's not going to go vote. What is he voting for? And I could not convince him. This is a great-grandchild of Nelson Mandela that's refusing to vote. That gives you a glimpse of how the youth are feeling right today.
All right, so a challenging time. Sello, I want to keep going to this legacy thing, and you know, the Nelson Mandela that I grew to understand and know, we're asking whether his legacy is being preserved, but he probably would say, look, I don't want you to preserve anything about me, but rather the work that we were all doing. Is that a fair assumption?
Look, I always say that I'm the last one to speak on Madiba's behalf, and I try avoid that at all costs. In fact, I wouldn't know what Madiba would be thinking today, but I know for sure we can do more and we can do better, both in terms of the very issues that Ausindileka pointed out, but also in empowering our young people to understand the journey traveled so far. It cannot be right that as we sit here today and we're discussing this, young people remain the people who are burdened by unemployment, that those who continue to suffer the brunt of any kind of abuse are women, predominantly black women, that we continue to have a country that's fractured along racial lines when it comes to inequality. So it's not just class, but class that's mixed with race. And earning, in terms of earnings, you still have black families earning less than white families. These are statistics from Stats SA. And I think if we are to do anything different...
I'm going to have to cut you for a second, because unfortunately this is where we're going to have to say goodbye to our SABC3 viewers. But don't forget, you can carry on watching this if you have access to channel 404 on DSTV. That's our news channel. All of that's still to come, so stay with us for that. But for SABC3 viewers, have a very good evening to you. Good night.
We express the hope that a climate conducive to a negotiated settlement would be created soon, so that there may no longer be the need for the armed struggle.
All right, so again, that speech, the first time he spoke to the people after coming out of prison after 27 years, and that was in Cape Town. A lot of this will play out again tomorrow. We'll find out just now from the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation just exactly what is planned to commemorate tomorrow. But welcome back. Tonight we are asking that question: is enough being done to keep the legacy of former Nelson Mandela alive? And I'm joined by my guests in Cape Town, the Chief Executive Officer of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Sello Hatang, who's in Cape Town, and also here we're very, very lucky to have the granddaughter of Nelson Mandela, Dileka Mandela. All right, let's just take a look quickly at some of the messages that you've been sharing with us on social media. Anwar Chauhan says the political leaders of the various parties are not setting a good example to the citizens of the country. All state entities are collapsing. Commissions are highlighting these irregularities. Yet we have not heard of one politician going to prison. And Mayenku Dennis says that Nelson Mandela was a powerful, inspirational leader for all the generations all over the world. His legacy will always challenge African leaders, hands down. Laugh, laugh, laugh. And Tilo Gift says, well, the aim is to create a better South Africa for all. Get me right, for all. Now, the question is, did his legacy properly address the needs of the previously disadvantaged? All right, okay. In fact, let's put that question to you, Sello, first, because I think you started this conversation. Did his legacy set the groundwork to deal with some of the issues that we're still dealing with 30 years later?
I think the question I would put back to Gift is, did we expect Madiba to solve all those problems in one term? And I think that's the danger that we are again creating around President Cyril Ramaphosa, that we create the big man who can solve all our problems, and we just watch. And I think most of the time what we need to be doing is legacies are created for, rather a foundation for a legacy is created in order for us to build on. Walls must go on to that foundation that's laid by the person in the form of a Nelson Mandela. And I think if we are to do anything is to begin to even also reflect on self, to say, are we doing enough to honor that legacy? Shouldn't we be doing more to ask of our politicians difficult questions that in fact those who want to go into office just to begin to feed at the trough should shudder to even want to take an office like that, because we will hold them accountable. But we tend not to do that enough. We only get to be seen to be doing something closer to an election when we should be doing that as part of a longer process. One of the books that we published 2 years ago was called Dare Not Linger, which was looking at Madiba's, a transcript of Madiba's sequel to Long Walk to Freedom, which Ndate Mandlalanga helped finish off. And in there, Madiba keeps going back to this theme that it's not enough to just put people in offices, that those who are put in offices must be put through serious tests for them to live up to the challenge that comes with an office. And I think it's an important question that we should ask ourselves, Peter. What is it that we did after he helped lay the foundation for a more united South Africa, for a South Africa that would deal with the land question, for example? He gave the figures of what needed to be done in terms of the land restitution. We didn't meet those targets. We need to then be looking at how we keep looking after what our sister organization, the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund, deals with around children. How come that 30 years on, Madiba kept on going back to this theme that it's not enough to just be talking about children and their vulnerability, but all of us must do something about it. A neighbor knows someone who's abusing a child, yet we keep quiet. So it's those kind of things that we need to be doing.
All right, so the Albert Lutulis, Oliver Tambo's, Nelson Mandela's gave us a blueprint, as we were hearing, about what needs to be done, and I guess also clues about how. Where do you think we started to perhaps go off the rail and make mistakes?
I think one of the biggest mistakes we ever made was to abandon civil society, because civil society was the vanguard of the people. And because of that, you know, there's no strong voice for the people, because we had this notion that since it's our government chosen by the people, they will have our best interests at heart. But if you have to look at the protest march, at everything, the health sector, you know, crumbling, SOEs all crumbling, that is not so. And I believe that we need to go back to a robust civil society, because that civil society became the active citizens. We are now passive citizens that sit and complain all the time. We need now to say, what can I do to be able to change things? Yes, it's good to highlight what is wrong with the system, but we must go beyond highlighting, beyond our Facebooks, beyond our social media.
Who leads this civil society?
That's the thing, that people like to be led, huh? You can start with your own community. You know, I always say that family is a microcosm of society. If you can start in our families, because that's a space you can control, if you can start in our families of instilling a good value system, because if you even look at Madiba, Granddad was groomed to be the leader that he was through watching Tribal Council as a child, which means it has to start at an early age, because children learn by emulation. If you can start instilling those values and things that can make children be leaders, because he learned to be a leader through that Tribal Council, we should start in the families, because, as I said, it's a space you can control. Therein, then it will go to community, then it grows and grows and grows.
All right, so I just wonder, I mean, the majority of South Africans now are under 25. So many of them actually will remember Madiba more as a figure in history rather than someone who was alive and they heard speaking. So what should we be doing in terms of perhaps getting those nuggets of knowledge, wisdom and way of doing things? Should it be taught at schools? How do we keep that work ethic and that servant leadership ethic alive today with a young population that really know Mandela as a memory more than anything else?
You know, one of the projects that the Thembekile Mandela Foundation is embarked on now is on speaking to, rather dealing with the next cohort of leaders at universities. The Nelson Mandela Foundation will also be doing work in the space of training, or rather even just convening dialogues around Madiba's values as a servant leader to executives in corporates especially. But just tonight, I had the honor of addressing young Africans across the continent who have been brought here by Enel Foundation, who are this leading Italian company dealing with energy. And I think listening to their stories, what they are doing in terms of sustainable development, means that we need to then be reminding them, which is what I did tonight, was just to remind them that The Nelson Mandela that you think is a memory gone by actually also touched on sustainability, that the forest that he understood, that he enjoyed as a child, the streams that used to flow freely are now full of plastic and dirt, and because we are living unsustainably as a human project. And I think it's important that we touch their lives where it matters most. In other words, if they are specializing in engineering, you then make it relevant for that purpose. Because Madiba actually touched on almost every subject matter under the sun. And if we are to do that, Peter, we'll begin to make Madiba more real as a person than just a memory, than just someone who was too angelic to even reach what he lived for. And I like reminding people that Madiba, when asked the question about his legacy, he was asked, so how would you want to be remembered in future? He said, well, that would be very arrogant to have to determine to the next generation how they should remember me. It should be them who wake up in the morning and they say, that man did this, and we honor him for that. And I think all of us, every foundation named after him, or every facet of life, family, foundations, as a nation and as a continent, we need to always just remember to hold on, to hold fast and tight to that legacy of humility, of wanting to do more for others than for self.
All right, Stella, I know you're going to have to leave us shortly, but if you could just take us through the plans for tomorrow, what people can expect to see unfolding on this very important day.
Well, tomorrow is a very exciting day for us as a country, but listening to those 62 young people again, I was happy to hear that they're just as excited about the day. We're going to start off in Victor Verster early in the morning at 8 o'clock for us to then have the committee, the reception committee, that made sure that the work that needed to be done by Madiba, rather him being released from prison, was smooth. In fact, you're reminding me that Dennis Goldberg said, when you put 20,000 people as a crowd in any setting, there's bound to be trouble. Yet that day there was no trouble. How come? No crime was committed. People were joyous and they walked away. And his response, his answer to that was, it must have been that people knew that this was too important and bigger than all of us. And the second part of on the first part, once they've reminisced, we'll also have young people there saying, yes, we hear you about the past, but what do we need to do today in order to make sure that the future is better? And then part two will be with Nobel laureate Lima Bowie, who will then, from Liberia, who will then be speaking to a crowd inside the City Hall, talking about prisons of Africa. And these are both figurative and literal prisons. The Mandela rules that are about making sure that prisoners are treated humanely and that they are not traumatized, and ensuring that they can then reintegrate into society. But then also other prisons that are figurative prisons, which are about poverty and inequality. How do we break those prisons? It will end with the president speaking at 3:20, which is the time Madiba walked out of prison. So he will then speak to a crowd in front of City Hall in the Grand Parade. And there it will be about moving from freedom to, from liberation to freedom. What does it mean? That we need to be liberated from poverty and inequality, from abuse, from xenophobia that continues to ache our country, but also that we heal as a nation. How do we become constitutional beings? People who respect the law, who respect authority, but that authority is held accountable. So how do we make sure that these elements work together? That's what we'll then be hearing from the president at the end. But at the end of the day, we are saying to South Africans and the continent, that solidarity movement that we had in the past, we still need it today because we haven't arrived. For as long as there's some child out there who's abused, there's a woman who's abused, but that there's also a person who's unemployed, young person who's unemployed, we still have a long way to go for us to reach that goal that Madiba said we should reach.
Yeah, very special day for the president. I mean, we see those images of a much younger Cyril Ramaphosa running around as part of that team that made that release day run smoothly. And also, I guess, personally for him, somebody that had been identified by Madiba as a future leader.
Precisely, and we are excited about the president doing that work that he needs to do. But most importantly is for the president to also remember that he's not alone in carrying this burden. Ndileka said something that we shouldn't forget. We like being led, and we want the big man to lead us. It's about time that we then also lead, and we help the country get along, make sure that it gets to where it needs to be. All these things are about making sure that we give people hope, but not an empty hope. Hope that tomorrow will be better than today.
All right, Selo Hatang, thanks very much indeed for joining us. I know you've got a lot of work to do tonight, and hopefully you'll get some sleep for the big day tomorrow. Thanks so much for your insights tonight.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
All right, so that's the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation speaking to us from Cape Town, and the SABC News Channel and some of our channels and radio stations will certainly be covering a lot of what happens tomorrow, so make sure you're a part of that. When we come back after the break, we'll start wrapping up this conversation with Ndileka Mandela. Stay with us.
Mr. de Klerk has gone further than any other nationalist president. In taking real steps to normalize the situation. However, there are further steps as outlined in the Harare Declaration that have to be met before negotiations on the basic demands of our people can begin.
Nelson Mandela on the 11th of February 1990. His first speech to South Africa and the world after spending 27 years in prison, setting up a difficult 4 years to democracy. A lot happened in that time, and leaving behind a legacy that we're discussing whether it's been properly preserved over time, 3 decades later. Well, these are some of the messages that you've been sharing with us, and let's go to them now, starting with Keketso, who says, leadership is something that Nelson Mandela and his peers fought for. We must refrain from making the struggle about one leader as though he was the Messiah. He wanted a free, fair South Africa with opportunity for all. We need to take the baton and rise to the occasion. Lesego says that they are doing well. They are fulfilling his agreements with apartheid beneficiaries.
Okay.
All right, so those are your messages. And I've got a feeling that you relate to what Keketso was saying.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Like I was saying to you earlier, Granddad and his generation did not complain. They made sure that things happen. We are a generation of complainers. We sit and complain all day long. And it's time, they set the foundation. Their mandate was freedom in our lifetime. They achieved that, which was the first building block of our democracy. Because if you remember, as a friend of mine that always says to me, if you don't have a seat at the table, you can't say anything. The seat at the table was gained by our political freedom. That was the first building block. The second building block is up to this generation. What are we doing instead of complaining? We elect a government, we don't hold them accountable, and we don't even, in government, there is no consequence management to people that embezzle funds, and there's commission of inquiry, appointment commission of inquiry with nobody being arrested, like it was, like some of the people treated. So it's about time that we stop complaining. And what am I doing in my small space to change things?
And I suppose what was big about people around that time, the Mandelas, the Sisulus, that they worked for no reward, that they didn't wait for anybody. They just said, listen, we have to mobilize. And that's what you think is missing now, this idea that Is there a T-shirt? Are we going to get a stipend and that kind of thing?
I always say that a leader is a microcosm of society. If you look at the generation of Granddad and with his administration, it was that generation of not expecting anything in return. Granddad came into presidency, donated his salary to the poor people, you know, to start the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund. And that cascaded down through the entire society. Now, if you have a leader that is selfish, that selfishness is going to cascade right down. So we need to have, like Silo was referring to, Leading Like Mandela, which is the program that we you know, have a vision of actually teaching, taking it to schools. A leader is a microcosm of society from the top down, and the family from the bottom up. So the values of these two should be aligned. And you find that oftentimes when you choose leaders, we don't think to seek if these are aligned with your value system. Are they going to represent your value system? And this is what's missing. That has not been in place. That's why you see the rampant selfishness and corruption, because it's me, me, me. Yeah. That generation was not me, me, me. It was about everybody else, and that cascaded to the entire society.
Sello, before he left, he says, look, I can't speak for Madiba. I don't even want to get into his mind, but you are his DNA, and you spent time with him. He shared with you. If he was alive today, what would trouble him the most, and what do you think he would say, perhaps at a State of the Nation address?
What would trouble him the most is the poverty levels. Granddad would lament, even, you know, when we would go for our retreat in December, of the poverty levels of people, and that really bothered him. And knowing Granddad, like Silo, I wouldn't surmise to know what's in his mind, but knowing Granddad, he was never afraid to speak his mind. He shot from the hip, and it did not matter whether he stands alone. It did not matter. And what he would say, you know, when there's evidence of corruption, Granddad would fire those people and make sure that they face them out of the law. He did that with Mama Winnie when he disobeyed when she disobeyed his order and went on a trip. He fired her. So that's the type of man that he was. He would not be, you know, tiptoeing around issues. He would take decisive measures, because that's the kind of person that he was.
The other thing, you know, when I watched the xenophobic attacks unfold, I'm always reminded of how much of a Pan-Africanist he was, and that he would never have allowed that kind of feeling to take root. No,
like he wouldn't. Granddad, if the rampant attacks we saw downtown Joburg, Granddad would have called the army immediately. Granddad was not shy. I mean, when it came to things like that, he took decisive action. He would make sure that he restores order.
So, globally, what do you think his legacy is to the world? We've talked about South Africa, but the whole world started to chant his name, Free Mandela, and it became a symbol, I think, of what could be positive on the planet. We've become more global now. What do you think his legacy for the world is?
Well, because I've now been traveling a lot, I've just been to Cairo, Abidjan now, and Zanzibar. It's still, his legacy is still revered. I mean, sometimes I think Granddad is bigger outside South Africa than in South Africa, and I get invited to speak at places because of his legacy. You know, his centenary, so many of us traveling to countries far and wide because of that legacy, that this humility, this ability to forgive. So that is still held dear by people.
He was an exceptionally powerful man. Did he understand that power?
He understood it to a T. Granddad understood his power, and he knew how to wield it. He did not wield it irresponsibly. He did not wield it to suppress other people. He was a type of leader that was visionary. He set the vision, and he could take his comrades with him and the country with him. He took all of us with him. that's because of how much he knew he had power, he had charisma, he had finesse. He was he was brought up in a household of a king, so he knew how to wield that power.
You know, former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said, Nelson Mandela showed what is possible for our world and within each of us if we believe, dream and work together. And that's quite a powerful thing for the most powerful person in the UN system to say. And one hears and sees quotes about it. So there was always this belief in him that if we do things together, so much can be achieved.
Yes, I mean, for me, the other thing that boggles the mind with Granddad is that he never lost hope that they will come out of prison. I remember in a letter that he writes to Irene Buthelezi, Shenga's wife, he says, he talks about, you know, it's actually a letter that he writes to Evelyn, to Hundu. He says, I can imagine how you, Maki and Khatu feel, you know, and I would, don't forget that I will come out of prison. That was 1969. So even in 1969, after a few days that he was in prison, Granddad never lost the hope that he would come out of prison. For me, it's insane that he knew that he was incarcerated by a brutal system. They would have received a death penalty. But that hope, that unwavering hope, he had even early years in prison. And it's a hope that never wavered. That's why Bishop Mpumulwana always calls him the ancestor of hope.
All right, we're running out of time, but perhaps a final thought. Tomorrow, as people look back on this anniversary, what would you like people to think about the most?
Is to think of, as the Nelson Mandela Foundation always says, find the Mandela in you. Not just the Mandela, because perhaps nowadays people do, they have an affinity to certain leaders. Find a Mandela in you, find a Tambo in you, find a Sisulu in you, because I call these leaders, Mandela, Sisulu, Mbeki, Governor Mbeki, Chris Hani, a league of extraordinary gentlemen. Find something that speaks to you, that you can emulate, that will make them proud, because they each have different traits. Steve Biko, all of them, they were a different caliber of leader, the seventh leader that you talk about. So find in each one of those people, including my grandfather, something that you can relate to, that will make them proud.
Okay, I'll see. Delega Mandela, thank you so much. Asante Sana, thank you for sharing your thoughts and your memories with us this evening. And we hope tomorrow is a great celebration. And we hope that these new Mandelas, Sisulu's spirits will rise again. Thanks so much indeed.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the viewers.
And to you at home, thanks so much indeed for joining us. It's really been a pleasure being able to be with you. And let's hope next week Desiree will be back. But have a great evening and enjoy tomorrow as well. And just let some of the things that came out in the program tonight filter through a little bit and take action. Have a good evening, everybody. Bye-bye.